in what is an event of historic proportions, I apparently am easier to hear than staff. So when you all are talking, remember to get close to the microphone so people in the back of the room and those listening on the webcast can hear what you have to say, because we all do want to hear what you have to say. It's the purpose of the meeting. All right, now we'll reconvene and hear from the Department of Water Resources and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, our operations folks. Again, remember to press the green button and try and be as close to this as you can. It is a better sound system. I was trying to give myself points for remedial, but it's really just a better sound system, perhaps. Hi, and if you don't mind introducing yourselves, that would be terrific. Who's going to take the lead?
I'm going to start.
Hi, Laura. Great.
Good morning, Madam Chairwoman, members of the board. It's good to be here. Thank you very much for inviting us this morning. I'd like to say I'm the Chief Deputy Director for DWR. DWR is taking the water year very seriously. We're thinking about a new water year classification, abnormally below normal. This will be a 6th classification, so you may want to consider that next time you revise the water quality control plan.
Putting it in. Yeah, there are a few things we've thought of that we need to put in.
Aberrant, etc. Yeah,
Aberrant, so that's a great word. Aberrant.
ABN.
Let's hope.
We are taking it very seriously. We've been working very closely with your staff and the other agencies as we are trying to manage the water supply that we control for best beneficial uses possible. I'd like to say thank you very much for the rapid action on the petition, the temporary change petition, and thank you also for your staff's engagement. They've been very, very helpful in knitting all of our agents together as we've been considering how to proceed. So it's been actually unprecedented collaboration, I would say, and we've certainly needed that. We'll talk a little bit more about that probably this afternoon when we get to the real-time drought operations team. So I'm going to just introduce our speakers. We're going to have, first of all, Bill Croyle. Second from my left is our drought operations manager, and he'll be giving an overview of the current hydrology. And then we'll have John Lehi. Second from my left is our operator for DWR. He will be describing the current operations situation and what we're doing so far and some of the factors that we need to consider going forward. Paul Fucitani to my left with the Bureau of Reclamation will also be joining John and commenting on the operational situation. And then we will have Kevin Reese, regulatory specialist who's been working quite a bit on the issues, the fishery issues associated with the Delta Cross Channel gate closure. So he will speak to some of those concerns. And last, we have Mark Holderman, senior principal engineer, who will be discussing some of the possible scenarios that may lead to the need for temporary barriers to control salinity.
Thank you.
So I will stop there and hand it over to John. I'm sorry, Bill.
Thank you. Again, my name is Bill Croyle. It's usually not a problem to hear me, but if we do, let me know. I have a presentation, and I know your monitors aren't working. We did make copies available, so hopefully you have those in front of you. Thank you.
Great. And can people in the back of the room hear him? Raise your hand if you cannot. All right. Dial it up a little bit. I mean, just get closer to the microphone.
Sounds good.
Turn it up to 11,
yeah,
as
there
they
we go.
say.
That's the first time for me. So, again, my name is Bill Croyle. I'm the drought manager for the Department of Water Resources. My goal in my presentation is really to set a foundation for where we are on our existing conditions. And so we're going to work through kind of what the long-range forecast looks like, what has occurred over the last couple of days, but also the condition of our reservoirs or snowpack. And then right at the very end, a little brief slide on kind of how our agencies are all working together with regard to some of this information. Great. I'll move fast on that slide just as we set the foundation. First of all, what this slide is kind of, again, looking forward for the next 6 to 10 days. And so we look at these very closely. This slide was actually updated by NOAA on February 17th, so it's fresh. It's looking again out for this next 6 to 10 days. So what we see here is kind of what we've been seeing for most of this year so far, which is really the probability of precipitation is really far below normal, especially on the West Coast. The next slide is 8 to 14 days looking out. Again, this is a fresh slide as of the 17th of February. And again, what we see is a little bit of the probability of receiving rain on the North Pacific is above average, but here for the majority of California, it's either below average or kind of what we call even or neutral conditions in Central California with a little bit of moisture in Northern California, which we, of course, desperately need. Now here's the next 90 days. There's a series of these graphics that are produced again on a regular basis. This is a 3-month window because February is almost over and basically it looks like we're going to be dry for the remainder of the month. I looked at the March, April, May forecast. Again, this is the Climate Prediction Center looking out for the probability of precipitation. And what this slide shows again is kind of what we've been seeing this whole wet season is the probability is below average conditions or below normal. So what I have here is it has been raining on the North Coast, and so the last 5 days the North Coast, the Smith River watershed has been receiving kind of a typical storm event that we would normally see, but again it's pretty focused on that California-Oregon border and that small watershed. The red is and yellow is between 2 to 4 to 5 inches of rain. The purple is less than 1/10 of an inch. So even though some of our critical watersheds in the north has received some moisture, really not much in the last 5 days. The next slide is really looking forward. Rainfall. I'm sorry. Let's go back. That's forecast for the next 5 days. So not much rain. That rain's actually falling now or through tomorrow. So the last 3 days of this forecast are going to be dry in this region. The rainfall for that has occurred for the last 7 days is shown here. Again, there's not a lot of rain. We have less than 1/10 of an inch over a majority of the area here shown in the kind of the purple color. Although we did get significant rain up again in that north coast of the Smith River Basin, as high as 10 inches. This is a graphic that we use. It's available on our CDEC website. And this is really looking at the snowpack provided in 3 different primary areas of the state, the North Sierra or Trinity watersheds, Central Sierra, and Southern Sierra. And so we look at this on a regular basis as part of our snow survey program. Again, it represents data collected from a wide variety of agencies throughout the state and is really critical to helping us make water supply decisions throughout the year, the snowpack being one of our biggest reservoirs that we have to rely on. So in the north, we have 15%, in the central we have 33%. That's quite a bit higher because of our recent storm that we just had. And southern is 25% of normal to date. Statewide, currently it's 26%. I provide this trend, sometimes we don't look at this, but I think it's important to kind of, and I think already the conversation this morning is like, where are we with regard to past events? And so this kind of trend plot here, again, designed on the north, central, and south. As we can see, we're kind of tracking on some of the driest weather that we've had historically, that 1976, 77. On the north, it's right at that line, about 13%. Slightly higher in the central Sierras now that we've got that little storm event that came in. And then in the southern Sierras, again, it's tracking pretty close to the 76, 77. I'm going to go through a couple of these index slides. These are important, again, looking at some of our critical watersheds for water supply. This is our Northern Sierra 8-station index. This is updated today, or as of midnight last night. And so you can see the impact on the blue line at the bottom where it says current daily precip is 12.9. And so that's finally is with that last storm. Obviously, that's quite a big storm for this watershed or this particular region of the state. So it's bumped up just slightly above the 1923-24 driest year or the 76-77. And so, however, it's still that 41% of average, which would be under the blue curve there on the hydrograph. So here is the San Joaquin Watershed, a 5-station index, so similar graphics. So current precip is 8.5 and 34% of average. Again, tracking on the 76 and 1923 driest years. So this is our graphic that represents the reservoirs throughout the state, not all of them, but our primary ones that we look at. So it's Shasta, 37% of total capacity, 53% of average to date. And then our Lake Oroville, 39%, total capacity, 52% of average. And then Folsom, which was extremely dry, it's still very dry, but it was down pretty low. Finally, with this storm, had the American River watershed got a pretty good dose of rain during this big storm event we had a weekend or so ago, and so we bumped up almost to 30% of total capacity and 53%. And that much needed watershed. So this is a little bit more information on each of the kind of primary reservoirs we're looking at. This is Lake Shasta, so we have 1.7 million acre feet storage, slightly above the 76, 77 plot. Again, the blue part of the diagram is average, where we should be for this time of year. Here's Lake Oroville, is about 1.37 million acre feet, and well below the 1976-77 graphic, or the line. And then Folsom Lake. So this one, obviously there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of action on the local communities to try to address the lack of water in the Folsom Lake. And so you can see the storm that we recently had in the American River watershed had a huge impact on Folsom Lake. However, again, it's some of the driest that we've seen, tracking with the 76, 77. So talking with the locals, they're basically looking at this storm gave them about 60 days of more water, but definitely does not get them out of trouble. And so they, continuing to talk, additional conservation, lots of local coordination to address this concern. San Luis Reservoir. And so here's where we are with regard to, again, tracking the 1976, 77. We're bumping up just here recently with the storm, and again, we're trying to make sure that to the extent that water can be made available through storing that water for our public health and safety needs, that we can do that. But other than that, there's not a lot of water to go in to San Luis. I also pulled up some current inflow and outflows for some of these reservoirs. These are some of the reservoirs we talk a lot about. And of course, the inflow here is Shasta, about 5678 as of this morning. Outflow is about 2691. Oroville, Folsom, and New Maloney shown there. This data is available on the web, and obviously our CDEC website is getting lots of traffic, which we like, and it's important to make sure that we're pushing this information out so people can be aware of the current situations, but also make decisions at the local, state, or federal level. What I want to do with my last slide is really talk about a little bit how all of this works for us. We're certainly with the Governor's Task Force. As you heard this morning, we're represented, all the agencies represented through this task force. There are weekly task force meetings. Cal OES is activated, their EOC. There's a weekly operations period from an emergency management standpoint. A lot of that has to do with reporting, monitoring, of course, situations statewide. Reporting, advanced planning is becoming more and more critical as we kind of, in some cases we're in preparedness mode, in some cases we're in response mode. And so that comes into mission tasks, and there has been a couple mission tasks throughout the state, which the department and others have responded to. And of course, as indicated with regard to agency coordination, lots of agencies, departments at local, state, and federal agencies are coordinating together through their department operations centers. And I think the coordination is amazing to see with the breadth of issues on the topics. We're definitely out of the box with regard to some of our guidelines and policies. And I think from what I can see, everyone is really stepping up and trying to make sure we put our best foot forward and resolve differences and things as fast as we can. And of course, probably the newest action here is the federal resources are definitely gearing up and coming into the state as we integrate that into the state's response to this drought. With that, I'll close my presentation.
Terrific. Questions so far? Great.
Okay, good morning, Chair Marcus, other board members. Again, my name is John Lehi. I'm Chief of State Water Project Water Operations Office. And to my right here is my counterpart over at Central Valley Project, Paul Fujitani. And we are going to walk you through the impetus for the urgency change petition. So let's see if we could have, it's the SWP CVP. There we go. And unfortunately, I apologize, you may not have a hard copy to look at there, so hope you don't strain your necks.
No, that's okay. Just
okay.
don't. We're not being rude if you see the back of our heads periodically.
Okay.
I'm trying to see if I can see it in the reflection.
All right. So, how I have our talk broken up, we're going to start with the impetus for the petition, and Bill's presentation is a good segue for that because it's driven largely, of course, by the January hydrologic picture that we were looking at. We're going to then walk you through what the proposed modifications were and why we chose those, and then talk about the order implementation. So the early January hydrologic picture, here's another way to show some of the same data that Bill was showing. Again, a reminder, this is the Northern Sierra 8 station precip for calendar year 2013, and of course we all know this, but you look in the lower left-hand corner, you see an outlier down there is 2013. So not only was it the driest on record, it was by far the driest on record. So things have not started any better. Of course, you know, there's overlap between calendar year, water year, but water year 2014, as it looked in the middle of January, you could see that we started to track just drier than the driest on record to that point, which was the 1976-77 year. Again, coming off of this being the third below normal year in a row, reservoir storage was not in very good shape, in addition to the very dry conditions starting this water year. You can see the various percents of the average, the 15-year averages for this particular date, which we picked January 20th. You can see the fraction of storage that was contained in each of these major reservoirs for SWP, CVP at that point in time. And probably more disturbing was the lack of snowpack behind the reservoirs, behind the surface storage. You know, a much bigger portion of our supply actually comes from the snowpack than it does the actual surface storage. So the fact that we were seeing in the Northern Sierra 4% of an April 1st average by mid-January was again quite disturbing. So based on the snowpack information or lack thereof and the projections for precip for the remainder of the year, what we receive are runoff forecast estimates for the coming year. So this plot looks similar to the other one I showed you. Rather than this one is not precip, this is actual runoff in the Sacramento Valley for the period 1906 through 2012. So this is a runoff rather than precip, but of course there's a strong correlation there. The red arrows indicate the projected runoff by exceedance for conditions as of January 1st. So this is still quite early in the water year. So what is actually remarkable about this is if you see the kind of the average, that 18 million acre feet, We actually had the projections at the very wettest cases, the 25%, 10% exceedances. Those were actually, the projections were going to be drier than average, even though we were, almost halfway through the, actually about a third of the way through the wet season. So that first third was so wet, and the antecedent conditions from last year, so dry, in the beginning of the water year so dry, that it had moved the estimates remarkably low for each of these exceedances. In fact, the 50% median expected runoff for the year was actually drier than a historical 90%. And you can see the 90% and the 99 were outliers as opposed to the historical record. So those runoff forecasts are a big part of what go into the operations studies that both DWR and Reclamation put together on a monthly basis. And so we ran our January operations studies, and in blue here, so one of the results that comes out of these studies, we'll run the runoff through the reservoirs. We've got all the requirements as far as the in-stream flow requirements, the outflow requirements, any of the other requirements, flow requirements, salinity requirements in the delta. And one of the outputs is what is the expected delta outflow for each month. And we did this we do this typically for the 90% exceedance, a dry case for planning purposes, and also a median case, the 50% exceedance. So the blue lines are based on that median case. The dashed line would be the required delta outflow per month from January through September. And from our study, DWR study, we then had what our projected outflows would be for each of those months. And as you can see under the 50%, we were actually forecasting, which is typically the case, that there is plenty of unstored flow to meet the requirements in the first 3 months of the year. And so we were actually showing there'd be some excess in those first 3 months. But by the time we got to the summer, the outflow requirements are not as great. It's for salinity management, though, in the delta, and we were able to just meet those in that 50% study. Now, however, this last rainstorm, for example, is a good example of unstored flow event that puts us temporarily, in this case it was very temporary, in excess conditions. So that kind of correlates to this blue line study. The other color there, which I'm not sure what color that is, but that is the 90%, and I guess it's olive. The 90% study showed that the requirements again will be dashed there. You can't see them because they're overlaid by the solid line, but the requirements are much less in the dry scenario because the D1641 standards have adjustments. If it's drier, the requirement is less. And so we were showing that we would have enough water in the storage to meet those requirements in the first part of the year, but by the time we got to the summer, storages would be drafted down to dead pool or near dead pool, at which point our release capabilities are greatly diminished, and this resulted into output showing forecasted outflows 0 or negative delta outflows this summer. And so insufficient outflow to meet all of the D1641 requirements in that 90% study. And Paul, please chime in anytime.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if you can hear me okay, add a couple things on that. In Reclamation, we prepare a similar set of studies and forecasts. And one thing that we were also observing is that because of the very low reservoir storage that we were having, that we saw in January, let's have some notes here. Around the 20th, we had Trinity at about 1.7 million acre feet. Shasta Reservoir was about 1.66 million acre feet. Folsom, about 169,000 acre feet. And the forecast was showing that we really weren't gaining much storage over the remaining parts of the winter and into the springtime when we should be peaking in storage. It's pretty flat and then down from there. So along with these studies, we were seeing that by midsummer, we basically didn't have much storage there. Our reservoirs are going near minimum power pool, even maybe getting close to dead storage, where we can't pull water out from the reservoirs any longer. And with that, as you might expect, our cold water pool was basically non-existent at that point. So a big concern we had was just our ability to maintain any kind of temperatures for salmonids in the Sacramento River, American River, and Stanislaus River to a certain extent also. So that was a big consideration in our operations as we came in with a temporary urgency change petition.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yes, temperature control was another big factor that the studies were not looking good. As far as the salinity picture, really, I think the best way to characterize what the results would be based on these outflow model results would be basically the 50% exceedance has us in the period since the major reservoirs were built in the system and control of that salinity. So the map on the left shows that period since construction of the major dams upstream and controlling that freshwater corridor through the delta in the summertime for all beneficial uses. The 90% study was basically telling us we were looking at a 1930s type delta if this forecast plays out. And so you can see there on the right the isohaline lines. This is 1,000 parts per million chloride, so basically 4 times the standard as far as the saltwater intrusion that you're seeing there on the right-hand side. And basically those are the types of salinity levels that we would be forecasting based on the results of 0 to negative delta outflow.
So at that point, obviously, it's beyond municipal drinking water by a mile and even not suitable for ag.
That's correct.
So essentially, everybody just stops
It's no good for
till it rains a bunch.
any beneficial uses, correct. And then we would be solely dependent on conditions that, Mother Nature basically has to bail us out at that point. There have to be sufficient rains to overcome the parched soil conditions plus, enough runoff to flush the salt back out. And that's the situation we'd be in.
And that's in June?
Yeah, so it would be, so if this was the condition in June, we would have to hope that at least average probably to above average conditions the following winter to get control once again of salinity conditions.
But would you advise us to hope that we'll get saved? I mean, shouldn't we be doing something now?
Yes, and that is one of the things we are doing is the next slide, which is, it is the impetus for this change petition. This is at least one step of what we were looking at to help change this picture. So, and I'm going to go into that. Actually, that's a good segue. So, January hydrologic picture, late January. Again, this is more of the same, but here's just to again show. So basically, the studies, that was a 90%. So you say, well, 1 in 10 chance, but that's unacceptable level of risk based on the severity of the outcome, of course. But even there, moving through the month of January, we were not seeing any relief, where January is typically our wettest month for the Northern Sierra. We ended up with an inch right at the end of the month. We had 1.2 out of an average of 8 inches for January. But at the time, in late January, you can see the 2014, again, just an extreme outlier, uncharted territory. As of late January, we had 3.5 inches. In 24 and 27, we had 17 inches. Of course, we were only halfway through the water year, but then again, that's a huge hole to make up. On top of that, this is the same type of NOAA seasonal models that Bill showed that was up to date. These are the ones that we saw back in January, below normal for January, and for the 3-month for much of California, January, February, March, also looking drier. So that was tending to push those exceedances to the left. So in fact, this picture from January 1st, we could project everything moving to the left. And in fact, here's the January, the new numbers for February. Here's the new runoff numbers for February. So again, all of these exceedances, as expected, moved to the left. In fact, the median is now pushed to almost outlier condition. Not quite as bad as the 90% from the previous month, but a lot closer. So that was what spurred the action. So what our proposal is 2 parts, and one was to reduce the February outflow requirement, because at that point in time we didn't want to release any additional upstream releases and hold on to what we had to try to prevent what we saw in the loss of salinity control scenario. While that was occurring, we also proposed minimizing exports to the health and safety needs and not releasing any water for anything other than minimum health and safety needs. The other part of the proposal was to open the cross-channel gates. I'll show some slides where salinity conditions had slowly been degrading over December and January because of the low inflows into the delta. And again, this would also help minimize additional upstream releases. So the delta outflow modification, here is that one graphic. The olive was the original plan, where we would be able to meet the standards up front in the first few months of the year, but by the time we got to the summer, you can see where the outflow, the system crashed. So in our proposal would be the black line, where we only release water to keep salinity control in the delta as we go through the spring. And so that's basically what our recommendation was, which was approved conditionally. And that we still started to lose. We were not able to meet the standard, as you can see there, in August, but at least we had some positive outflow. So 2,000 CFS outflow average is what's shown in August there. Just to give us, this is just a look with the DSM-2 model, give us an idea that the difference in the 2 scenarios. So basically the black line, because we were advocating less outflow early on, there'd be higher salinities, but we'd be able to hold them at least some margin of control through the summer. Whereas the original scenario, which is the olive, we'd have better water quality early because we're meeting the higher flow standards, but then of course we run out of water in the system, and we've got ECs over 3,000 EC at Clifton Court by the time we got to the summer. So that's again why we proposed what we did. The cross-channel gate opening, so just to get oriented, this was kind of the real-time water salinity management here in December and January. We have a number of stations that we use to monitor the salinity in the delta to manage to. Bethel Island is one I'm going to point to here. You're going to see a graph of it, and it's just on the west end of Frank's Track there, but that's a good indicator. If we see EC that at that point, if it gets high enough at that point in the delta, we will often see it show up at the M&I diversion locations throughout the delta, including Rock Slough, Old River Pumping Plant, and the banks in Tracy. So here is the actual historical salinity conditions starting from December 1st, 2013. You can see the very highest line there, because aqua color is the Bethel Island. The purple is the DMC, and the olive is Clifton Court. And so you can see our 1000 EC concern level. It's also the standard on a monthly basis as the red dash line. So you can see that we were operating to about 4,500 to 5,000 outflow through this entire period up until just recently. But during that whole time period, salinity conditions continued to degrade. In fact, this was actually counter to what our models were telling us, that would have been sufficient outflow to maintain the salinity. But things continued to degrade on us. Part of that, we think, is maybe bad assumptions on consumptive use, for example, in the delta, which is just an assumed number, and maybe the model was not picking that up. But at any rate, as you can see, things continued to degrade. As we got into January, you can see the kind of up and the down on the Bethel number there. So in early January, you saw it came up, and then a little bit of relief second week. That's tidal action, so that's the spring versus neap. So during the spring tide in general tends to worsen the water quality conditions. It then freshens a bit during the draining cycle, which is towards the neap tide. But as you can see, we were kind of taking one step forward, two steps back as we continued through this time period. And what shows up at Bethel is generally there's a delayed reaction before it actually hits the other diversion points further down in the system. So in the South Delta export locations, you can see Bethel started to get late December above 1. We actually did see some daily readings above 1 at the DMC and maybe a couple at Clifton Court here in the beginning of February. So as early as mid-January, started to request kind of this emergency operation of the cross-channel gates, and then we ended up lumping this into our petition as one of the modifications to the D1641 standards. And you can see there I point out when the gates were actually opened. It also coincided with, even that last week, there was a storm surge on top of the spring tide, which really shot the salinity way up. It was also February 1st was when we had the approval. We opened the gates. So a combination of the tide turning to a neap and increased outflow greatly freshened things up, and we're in much better shape today. Gates were closed on the 9th of February due to triggering of a fish trigger, but there was enough inflow in the system at that point that we were able to freshen up the system even with the gates closed. Is there anything you wanted?
I have a question on this. You're saying that conditions continue to degrade. Is this inconsistent with what you had modeled before you requested the order? In other words, did it achieve the result that you were seeking?
The gate opening?
Yes.
Yes, and it's hard to tease out exactly how much of this was due to the gate opening versus the change in the diurnal monthly tidal cycle and the increase in flow. But certainly there was benefit to the gates being opened. This shows an enormous benefit based just on the opening of the gates, but it's a combination of those three factors: the tide changing, the increase in delta inflow, and the gates opening.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of the actual stations within the delta and look at the balance of salinity on, say, San Joaquin side of the delta versus Sacramento River side, you can see that the opening the gates did help the situation and improve the salinity more towards the San Joaquin River side, which is what we had expected.
Okay.
Something else too, that slide, just again maybe to drive home a point, but you can see how the salinity was just gradually increasing and stepping on up from December on as we went through the season there. And in fact, those are far above what we would normally be operating to maintain our salinity standards in the Delta. If this were a more normal year, if we were under that situation, we would be, if we can't open the gates because of the fishery concerns, we would be, again, going back to minimum exports, which we did, but also in a more normal year, we would be increasing releases upstream, trying to freshen it up. But because of the low storage, we refrained from doing that.
Right. That's a key point. That one of the reasons we allowed the salinity, well, for one reason, it threw us off because our modeling was not indicating that things would go this bad. The other, we saw the observed readings get this high, but we were reluctant to release more water from upstream because of the dire picture upstream. So that was why we were asking for the cross-channel gate opening. Now these marks at Bethel probably were the highest that we've ever seen. I think going back at least 20 years, probably 30 or more years, as far as how bad the water quality conditions got just within the last 2 months. So order implementation. So the approvals were for a delta outflow of no less than 3,000 CFS. A maximum export for minimum health and safety not to exceed 1,500 CFS. The cross-channel gate opening on February 1st. And then the kind of the amended order included that if D1641 requirements are met, that the exports could be greater than the 1,500, but limited to natural or abandoned flow, or another way to say that, unstored flow. So this is the timeline of the actual implementation. This graph shows the outflow in blue, delta outflow in blue, solid blue, the X2 standard 7100. I just noticed there's an error there because there was no X2 standard in January. That started in February 1st, so the dash line should start on February 1st. I've also depicted the minor precip event late January that actually brought up the outflow right at the end. So immediately after we submitted our petition, outflow bumped up. So that's one way to get more water in the system, is petition the board. The little bit, and then of course there was the larger precip event. The second week, in the first week, end of the first week of February, was that I think it was 7.5 inches of precip over 4 days for Sacramento wide, and of course that had a huge effect on outflow. So as it turns out, we were actually meeting the X2 standard 7100. We have met it. It has been met, let's put it that way, since February 1st. But there were savings involved in the fact that we didn't know the precip was going to come. We didn't know to what extent. A big part of that outflow equation is a reduction in consumptive use in the delta, and that's dependent upon precip, at Stockton Fire Station. So that's not something we can easily predict. So in reality, if we were trying to operate to this standard, we would have bumped up releases significantly towards the end of January from probably Shasta and Oroville. And so the fact that we didn't do that, because of the petition, there was some savings upstream associated with that. You can also see here in red is the export levels. The dashed is the minimum export of 1,500 CFS. You can see that for much of that time, even prior to the petition going into effect, we were at a little bit lower than that. So again, we were really struggling with that water quality picture, so we were trying to reduce, because we had no storage upstream to add to release into the delta. We were doing what we could to minimize the exports. So on the State Water Project side, we were just meeting the demands of our South Bay contractors, whose only source of State Water Project water is from the delta. They cannot access water from San Luis Reservoir. So that was what we were looking at there. That for a short period of time, we can export at a even lower rate than that combined 1,500, but it's really not a sustainable rate. We did submit our report on health and safety export levels to the board on Friday. At this point in time, the 1,500 CFS remains our best estimate as far as a sustained minimum health and safety export level. The question's an easy one to ask, but it's a hard one to answer in the fact that basically we are a wholesale provider who provides to a number of contractors who are also wholesalers, who have a number of districts at the retail level. So it's a very difficult question to get at as far as what is a health and safety level. In our report, we referenced the 50 gallons per capita per day, and our understanding that is for sanitation and drinking water. It does not include the fire suppression piece. So we have requested more detailed information from our contractors. Both SWP and CVP have requested additional information from our contractors on these minimum requirements. And so we will continue to work with them and keep the board informed as we move forward on this.
It strikes me that it's in their interest to get you that information quickly.
And I think initial feedback is they're struggling with this as well, as far as how to define these numbers.
Is it beyond population served?
Yeah, I
Don't you have to do a cross between who's dependent on it, since every region, practically every farm, but every region of the state has a different mix of water sources. So
Well,
you're
that's-
going to have some customers that have ample alternative sources and some that don't.
that's exactly right. So the vast majority of our contractors have multiple sources, and so what they're having to do is, and those other sources are also being strained in addition to the state water project sources. So that becomes quite a complex mix of, okay, well, if I don't have state water project water, I can go to this other source, but I've got the same kind of issues happening with the other source here. So I think that's a big part of what they're struggling with on this. I think the water quality piece enters into this as well, especially since we are showing the potential for a loss of salinity control this summer. There's also the need to change the place and time. So to the extent that we can add to storage with usable water now for blending purposes later, I think that's another piece of this that would come into play. So, for example, there's limited blending opportunities on the South Bay Aqueduct, but we can do what we can to get some usable water in Del Val, Lake Del Val, for blending later. Even the water that the additional exports that we've been exporting now, since both all the D1641 requirements are now being met, so we have the higher export rate, which is currently being controlled, or had been controlled by the biological opinions, the Old and Middle River flow limitation. That's what's been controlling us for the last week. But that additional export is some of that's been going into San Luis, and that could play into blending later in the event that there's a loss of salinity control. So all of these factors will weigh into providing those minimums to the 25 plus million Californians that depend partly on the state water project supply.
I'm not sure at the time horizon. It's an interesting point.
And just with the CVP side also, like you mentioned, some of our contractors are having a real difficult time just trying to determine where the water supply is coming from. And we have one of them in particular that relies on both the CVP and state water project supply. And when there's so much uncertainty on both sides, it's, okay, where are you getting your water and what's your minimum health and safety of either project? It's tough to come up with a figure. And a lot of those numbers are dependent upon other sources which are dependent upon other allocations too. So
Right, that's right.
it's a very number. We're still trying to sort through that. Well, with our contractors trying to sort through that. On our side also, we have other obligations, commitments south of the Delta that we feel are very important to this mix. Part of that being our commitment to deliver water to the wildlife refuges in the San Joaquin Valley,
Right.
and our commitment for the exchange contractor deliveries. There are other considerations too, for agricultural considerations. One in particular is dust suppression. That becomes to be a real problem in some areas for safety concerns. So we try to mix all that, or bring that all into the mixture of what's required for our pumping needs out of the Delta.
I have some questions.
Sure.
So on the issue of dust suppression, and earlier you mentioned fire suppression, right now that's not included in the 1,500?
Well, it's not included in the 50 gallons per capita per day.
Right,
It
okay.
was what my statement
But
was.
it's included in the 1,500.
Well, I think that's the part. We don't have a better number at this point. I think that's what we're still sorting out is how does that translate to an export rate when you're taking into account all of the health and safety needs throughout the project and this kind of shift in time issue as well. So I think